So we've talked about how to understand electronic systems, complex electronic systems, but what about understanding in the scientific sense? The physical sciences are the standard by which the rigor of other sciences is judged. But understanding in these hard physical sciences is also based on analogous hierarchies of description. For example, at high level, we can predict how a structure will perform from the properties of the materials it's made up of, like how water erodes rock, or how lava flows across land, or how an aeroplane flies by interacting with the air, and so on. We can predict the properties of materials from the chemicals they're made of. We can predict the properties of chemicals from the molecules they're made of. We can predict the properties of molecules from atomic properties. And we can predict the properties of atoms with remarkably high accuracy from quantum mechanics. One key difference between levels is that the number of what I'll call units of description used are different. In quantum mechanics, we're dealing with a relatively small number of different types of units: electrons, protons, neutrons, photons, and a few other additional elementary particles. At the next level, there are about 100 different types of atoms with different numbers of protons and electrons and so forth. There are large numbers of molecules that are different combinations of atoms. Each chemical is a group made up of some very large number of identical molecules at some particular temperature. And because each material is made up of a different mixture of a large number of different chemicals, there's an even larger number of different possible materials. So, at the most detailed level, there's a small number of units of description, and the interactions between them are mathematically precise. Hence, extremely accurate predictions can be made, and quantum mechanics is regarded as the paradigm for a hard science. At higher levels, each unit of description is a combination of the units at more detailed levels, and we use approximations for the interactions between these higher level units. We don't explicitly include most of the interactions between their more detailed components. But these more approximate interactions can nevertheless make predictions that are almost always accurate enough, and if there's a problem, we can always shift down to a more detailed level. So the big question is, can we find or define a hierarchy of descriptions that we can use to understand the human brain? But it's not obvious that the answer is necessarily yes. Even in the physical sciences, it's not always possible. As an example, think about the problem of predicting the weather. The system includes the atmosphere and the oceans of the Earth, and we'd like to know what the weather will be tomorrow in our area. Can a prediction like that be made in a way that humans have a good intuitive feeling for how it was derived? To do that, you need to create a hierarchy of descriptions in which descriptions on each level are comprehensible to a human mind. Maybe you could divide up the surface of the Earth into a relatively small number of cells and think about weather in terms of the interactions between those cells, ignoring most of what went on inside the cells. Then divide large cells into groups of smaller cells in such a way that you could mostly neglect what was going on outside the group. Then you could just think about the group of smaller cells and maybe understand how the weather at a particular time in one region of interest resulted from prior ocean and atmospheric conditions. Now, this can be done to some degree. If there's a weather system drifting in a certain direction, a human can understand why the weather's probably going to be stormy in some locations. But the problem for human understanding is that very small differences in the exact conditions in a tiny cell in one location can make a huge difference to the gross conditions all across a distant, larger cell a bit later. The commonly offered caricature is that whether or not a butterfly in Brazil flaps its wings at some point in time can make the difference between there being a storm or not in Europe a few months later. This type of system is called chaotic, where tiny differences in initial conditions can make a huge difference to the later overall state of the system. The butterfly flapping its wings makes a difference over a period of months, but larger differences make a difference over periods of weeks, days, or hours. Hence, the amount of information needed to describe weather over the periods of time of interest to humans is too large to be followed by a human imagination. So the only way to predict is to use huge amounts of computer processing. Now, in reality, all complex physical systems are chaotic over a long enough time frame. But sometimes, for systems that humans want to understand, the chaotic behavior doesn't manifest itself on the timescales of interest. So the problem is that for the weather system, there are no intermediate entities that can be used to construct intermediate levels of description. So intuitively satisfying descriptions on different levels of detail that can be mapped into each other can't be constructed within the limits of human mental capabilities. So is the brain a chaotic system like the weather, or an understandable system like a computer? If it's a chaotic system on the timescales that determine cognitive responses, the only thing we'll be able to do is to carry out massive simulations that will emulate cognition but provide very limited intuitive understanding. Now, there's an aspect of brains that encourages the belief that they're understandable. Both electronic systems and brains have objectives. An electronic system may have objectives like providing continual internet services to a group of users. Brains have objectives like surviving and producing offspring. Systems like the weather don't have objectives. Weather is just what happens. Furthermore, both types of systems, brains and computers, detect conditions in the information available to them and associate condition detections with behaviors, and these behaviors must tend to result in the system meeting its objectives. Now, with computers, we know how to create hierarchies of description. There are two general types of information process that are ubiquitous in every operation performed by computer hardware on every level of detail. And the existence of these processes means we can create hierarchies of description that we need to understand what computers are doing. But all these things are put there by computer designers to make their understanding possible. Is there anything comparable for the brain? Are there, for example, some analogous common information models? It would be very lucky if there were. But why should we get such luck? Brains don't have designers.